Ready?
Yes.
Excellent. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are around the world. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nationalic people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have this opportunity to be present in the territory. I'm Tom Cormier, President and CEO of Parliamentary Centre, and very thrilled today to bring together a very seasoned group of experts and leaders as part of this ongoing series supported by the US Embassy of Ottawa. The Global Democracy Series is a virtual US-Canada speakers program hosted by the Parliamentary Centre. And over the course of this year, we're going to have over a dozen conversations to look at different dimensions of international democracy assistance in light of modern challenges to democracy worldwide. This series is intended to contribute to both reflections on both sides of the border and beyond, in particular, support Canadian policymakers as they define forward engagement in this field. We're here today to talk about an important crossroads for policy and practice, how to engage in democracy assistance in highly insecure environments, whether post-conflict countries or countries that are prone to political violence. While Afghanistan is in the title and of course on top of our minds, this event is not intended to focus exclusively or primarily on the Afghan case. We want to learn from the setbacks and successes from around the world and help craft a constructive way forward, especially for US and Canadian actors. With so much discussion about Afghanistan at the moment, we position our dialogue strategically to focus narrowly on the field of democracy support in these environments. This isn't a post-mortem on the Afghan war or the August withdrawal. It's a forward-looking conversation about how to go forward more constructively in similar contexts, because these contexts exist everywhere and they're going to recur. Political violence is a reality in many parts of the world, and even in established democracies, from the January 6th incident on Capitol Hill to the tragic murder last week of David Ames in the UK. Increased threats to candidates here in Canada during our recent election. We're looking at some of the worst affected countries in the world today and how we can learn from recent experiences such as Afghanistan. I'd like to introduce and thank our Canadian moderators for today's event, starting with Nipa Banerjee, who is a senior fellow and adjunct professor in the School of International Development at the University of Ottawa. She's a principal researcher within the Centre for International Policy Studies and served 33 years in the former CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency. She was the head of Canadian government's aid program in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2006, and she's written extensively on Western development aid in Afghanistan. Joining her is Ben Rosewell, President and Research Director at the Canadian International Council since November 2018. Prior to that, Ben served as Canada's ambassador to Venezuela from 2014 to 2017, capping a 25-year career as a professional diplomat, including assignments in Canada's embassies in Egypt, to the United States, and Canada's permanent mission to the UN. He served as Canada's first diplomatic envoy to Baghdad, Iraq, after the fall of Saddam Hussein from 2003 to 2005, and as deputy ambassador to Afghanistan and as head of NATO provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar between 2008 and 2010. As a practitioner of international relations, Ben's thematic interests have been in human rights and democracy. He founded the Democracy Unit at Global Affairs Canada and worked closely with human rights activists in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nipa and Ben will take it from here and introduce our American speakers. And in the last half hour, we'll open the Q&A to the audience. The Q&A will be facilitated by our new Vice President for External Relations, Dr. Gabrielle Bardal, who is also the director of this virtual series. She's an expert on political violence in her own right, having written her PhD and worked extensively on the subject throughout her career. Nipa and Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Ben, you want to start?
No, you go first, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. I will introduce the speakers, the expert speakers from the US now. Dr. Stephanie Burkhardt is a US national security and defense expert based in the Washington, DC area. Since 2012, she has been a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis in Alexandria, Virginia. From January 2015 to August 2016, she was on detail to the US Department of State, where she worked on security governance in Africa. From August 2016 to 2017, she served as Director of Policy and Program Analysis in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Office of African Affairs. She is currently an adjunct faculty member at George Washington University. She has also taught courses at Georgetown University, American University, and the University of Cape Town. Dr. Bouchard earned her PhD in political science from Rice University in 2012. So I welcome Stephanie, and I will now introduce Vasu Mohan, who is with us also as an US expert. Vasu Mohan is Senior Global Advisor, Conflict, Displacement, and Minority Rights, International Foundation for Electoral Systems. For the past 2 decades, Mohan has worked on democracy, governance, and human rights promotion with a focus on post-conflict elections and democratic inclusion. He has been with IFEs since 2001 in the headquarters and the field, and supervised programs and field offices in over 22 countries, partnering with a range of international, regional, and national stakeholders. Mohan has designed, managed, and implemented electoral assistance programs in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Nepal and Sri Lanka in post-conflict contexts, and supported IFEs election violence mitigation programming in Georgia, Kenya, Libya, and Nigeria. Wow, a huge amount of experience in today's subject with both Stephanie and Vasu. So I welcome them both to this session. Well.
Thank you. I'll pick up the baton here, Nipa. First of all, just to say what an honor it is to be a part of this event today. Big supporter of the work of the Parliamentary Centre in this Global Democracy Series. I think is very timely for the reasons Tom mentioned. It's a pleasure to facilitate alongside Nipa, who preceded me in the Canadian Embassy in Kabul in the early years. I suppose I was in the middle years, 2008 and 2009 in my case, but in our post-government lives, Nipa has played a central role in a lot of the discussions on the development side of Afghanistan, and I try to play a similar role on some of the diplomatic aspects of Canada's mission. For those of you joining us from the United States, might not appreciate the extent to which Canada was involved in Afghanistan. I would characterize it as the single largest international mission that Canada has undertaken in any field in generations. It was, to the extent that the United States had Iraq and Afghanistan and any number of other conflicts, Afghanistan for us was all that rolled up into one. We put everything we had into that mission. We were very proud to have made the contribution that we did and devastated at the outcome. And so I think this is an extremely important conversation. Tom, I'll take your cue here that we won't focus on the past. I do think that that's an extremely important conversation. Focus on the future is every bit as important, because I think there probably are a lot of Canadians, at least, who are questioning the future of democracy support after Afghanistan. Not just how to do it, but just whether it should be done. And therefore, the conversations that I think we are going to be having today are absolutely critical for those of us that believe deeply in democracy support. There need to be some lessons learned, and there needs to be some changes undertaken. And so I'm going to be very interested to hear the contributions of our American counterparts. Let me start with an introduction of Patrick. Patrick Quirk is the Senior Director at the Center for Global Impact at the IRI, the International Republican Institute, one of the 4 great democracy promotion organizations created out of the National Endowment for Democracy Act in the 1980s. Absolutely central players in democracy promotion in every country around the world. He's also a non-resident fellow at Brookings, Before that, he did serve a stint in government on the policy planning staff of the State Department as the lead on fragile states conflict and stabilization and foreign assistance. And in that role, from 2018 to 2019, he conceptualized and managed the development of a new U.S. approach to fragile states. I've left Peter Steinhelfer for last, certainly not for least, but because he is going to be the first speaker. So we'll look forward to him kicking off the substantive presentations today. Peter Steinhelfer is the acting principal deputy assistant secretary. There's quite a lot of acting people in very senior roles in the United States, so I salute him for his patience. Must be a frustrating aspect, but we look forward to your confirmation shortly. He leads the Bureau's efforts to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict and instability in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and oversees the CSO's Office for Advanced Analytics. For those of you that aren't familiar with CSO, the Canadian Foreign Ministry has a bureau that attempts to do some of the same things as CSO, which is now called PSOP. It was originally called START in my day. This is, of course, PSOP on steroids, as you'll see from the size of the budget. Peter Steinhelfer oversaw a budget of $8.3 billion. It's an amount to make most Canadians blush. That many resources going into post-conflict reconstruction. It really is a absolutely central player in global efforts at post-conflict, and so really quite an honor to have him with us today. Before CSO, Peter Steinhelfer was Chief of Staff to the Special Representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan. He was the Paul Mill, or Political Military Affairs Chief at the Embassy in Kabul. He's done stints for INL and DRL, so the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and the Democracy, Human Rights and Labor Program. He is a graduate of George Mason University, both in the undergraduate level and in international affairs, and a Master's of Science in Peace Operations. So the degree of specialization I find absolutely incredible to have a whole master's degree in peace operations. We should have many more people with that specialization working in the field. He speaks German and he speaks Dari, which I should say, having served in Afghanistan, places him in a very, very small circle of major foreign diplomats that speak the local language. So it's a tremendous honor to have all four of you here. Peter Steinhelfer, without any further ado, we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, for that introduction. It's always embarrassing to hear someone read about yourself, but that's okay. But seriously, it really is an honor to join this great event alongside such a distinguished panel of colleagues. And I think this event is an example of the immense and strategic partnership between Canada and the United States, not just, as Ben mentioned, in places like Afghanistan, but in many places around the world. So let me also extend my appreciation to the Parliamentary Center, especially Dr. Gabrielle Bardal and Tom Cormier, for organizing this important discussion on democracy, violence, and conflict. And as you just heard, most of my career has seemingly touched on these topics. So I was very eager to join this conversation, even though I'm currently on vacation. So it's great to join you all today. So as I reflect on the introductory framing of this event, I have just a few initial observations, but I promise to save some time and not talk too long and save some time for Q&As. So first and foremost, from my perspective, when dealing with questions of democracy and conflict settings, I think it's vital that we clearly identify what we are trying to achieve and how we will measure success from the onset. In transitional societies, democracy and conflict are inextricably linked. We know this from the research. The weaker the democracy, the greater the risk for internal and external violent conflict. So building inclusive, credible, and effective democratic governance is a primary means by which societies achieve durable peace. But it's important to recognize that conflict prevention and stabilization goals are not always the same as democracy and governance goals. They're linked, but cannot always be conflated in our strategies. So therefore, when we're building our strategies, we have to ask ourselves from the onset, Is our priority to create an enabling environment for democratic governance to flourish? Or are we attempting to stabilize the environment enough while also strengthening democratic governance at the same time? And if the latter, do we really have the resources, tools, political will, and leverage to do both? And that's a difficult task to take. And so we have to identify clearly what our priorities are and recognize that we may not be able to do both particularly well. So this doesn't mean that conflict prevention and democracy promotion cannot be pursued simultaneously in conflict-affected settings. Rather, it means that we need to clearly delineate between those priorities when they're running along separate but related tracks. In the past, we've run into trouble in environments where we constantly changed objectives, we lacked a coherent and consistent strategy, or we tried to pull in too many things underneath one broad umbrella. We failed to take seriously the results from comparative evaluations or lesson learned exercises. So as we look to do things differently, and I really believe that we can, we have to be realistic and honest in setting our goals, including identifying whether our near-term focus is going to be on democracy and governance or on conflict prevention and stabilization, and then understand how do we build a longer-term strategy and the metrics that go along with it to engage. So learning from these lessons, we in the State Department and the US Interagency are embarking on a new approach, following the principles envisioned in the Global Fragility Act, including prioritizing local partnerships, elevating conflict prevention, using strategic monitoring and evaluation, and so forth. And the key point to this is that we will be nesting shorter term efforts or shorter term strategies into a longer term 10-year plan. And this brings me to my second point. It's all about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And that, in my view, must be conducted at multiple levels. We're aware that, particularly in conflict environments, the United States has at times measured success by whether or not a project has been completed, rather than whether it contributed to larger, more strategic goals. So having worked in many of these environments, it's understandable, I get it. Each project has a purpose, it's likely achieving really good things, and we're frankly often inundated with the day-to-day efforts to just get projects up and running, that it's easy to lose focus on the grander strategy. So what we often miss is whether activities and engagements actually are achieving a significant impact on the longer term strategic goals. So to avoid this, I posit that we need to monitor, evaluate, and have a learning agenda based off of multiple different levels. I often use the phrase layering of metrics, which means doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning at the individual project level, the broader program or sectoral level, as well as the top level strategic approach. So context monitoring will be vital to evaluate the changes or measurements in that country context that are often, frankly, difficult to attribute to one particular initiative or a series of projects. But I would suggest that they still provide invaluable guideposts to see, are we actually making a difference? Now, all of this is complicated and difficult, but I fundamentally believe it's absolutely necessary. It becomes even more complicated to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning when we're working in a conflict environment or a near conflict environment with many interactions by international actors, and it's a recipe for the proverbial too many cooks in the kitchen. So how do we pursue these layered metrics to successfully gauge progress and impact? Among other tools, we need to have publicly available data sources that can measure progress at the global, national, and subnational level. And these data sources have to be public. So that way, the international community can all access the information at the same time with the same information, and therefore we can move together in common effort faster than we have before. Without it, we will continue to focus on our individual efforts, which only tell a narrow part of the story. Fortunately, there are many avenues that are being created and sustain this kind of data. For our part and the part of many of our other colleagues in the international community, we've invested in global data sets such as the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLID, to improve our global public awareness of violent events around the world in real time. Most recently, we also launched an initiative alongside our German, Dutch, British, and UN colleagues to create a multi-donor trust fund known as the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, or CRAFT. And Canada, I know, has also expressed support for this initiative. So modest investments from multiple donors in this kind of baseline global, regularly updated data can create a common operating picture, collective understanding, and combine with traditional diplomatic approaches to make for more thoughtful and effective foreign policy and US or international strategies. So finally, I want to conclude my remarks with a quick point on inclusion. More than 2 decades of empirical and peer-reviewed research demonstrates that equality and empowerment of women and girls leads to better outcomes for societies. We know there are links between gender inequality and risks of conflict and instability, the status of women in a country's propensity for violence. We also know the importance of women's participation in conflict prevention and resolution efforts, but research and talking points must be translated into action. Our verbal commitment to gender equality must be consistently reflected in our strategies, in our priorities, in our policy initiatives. Otherwise, we continue to have programs that amount to effectively being a talking point without that grander strategic impact. So what are we doing on our end? We are dedicated to promoting the meaningful participation of women and other representative populations in political and security decision-making processes. And so, for example, CSO, my bureau, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, is creating a new negotiation support unit that will impress upon US diplomats the importance of incorporating existing networks of women peace builders at the negotiation table. Will create requirements for women's participation in peace processes, and will identify male allies and where they are absent, to advance awareness raising opportunities for men to open their minds to these issues. So with that, I'll stop there and I'll turn it back over to you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter Steinhelfer. I'll turn now to Dr. Quirk.
Thanks so much, Ben. Really great to be here. I'll organize my remarks into 2 core sections. In the first, I will offer a few policy level recommendations for improving democracy assistance in these types of contexts. Here, I'll emphasize that success really starts with getting policy and strategy right. In the second, I'll draw on recent research we've done at IRI to offer a few best practices from an operational sense, particularly related to inclusion in measuring success. To start, the first framing question for today's session asks for practices we can identify to build and sustain democratic institutions in conflict-prone countries. The tendency in answering this is to shift immediately to the technical aspects of democracy assistance, such as how best to strengthen institutions or political parties. Now, these, of course, are critical considerations and what I'll address shortly, but before doing so, I want to offer 2 higher level policy-focused recommendations that can set a foundation for success. The first is that the US and allies need to truly prioritize democracy building as a foreign policy priority in these settings. Over the last 2 decades, countering terrorist threats was a key ordering principle for US foreign policy. And this meant that the US would in some instances look past how leaders treat their people or respect democratic norms if the regime in question was a reliable partner in the war on terror. Now, the menace of terrorism from non-state armed actors has certainly not fully dissipated, but it no longer remains the core threat to Americans' livelihood and security. The factors the US uses to shape and execute policy need to be updated accordingly and reflect the new threat landscape. In particular, the Chinese Communist Party's campaign to undermine democracy and popularize autocracy. And making democracy essential rather than peripheral interest will come with trade-offs. This could involve reevaluating alliances that, while once convenient to fight non-state armed actors, are counterproductive for achieving our interests today. It might also involve pressuring US allies that are backsliding for abusing their citizens. Now, to be clear, more fulsomely considering democracy in foreign policy decision-making is not to say that this factor should consistently trump other interests. That's unrealistic. Rather, my recommendation would be to move up protecting and promoting democracy higher in the list of rank order priorities. So the US is foreign policy that effectively addresses the current threat landscape rather than needlessly holding on to outdated assessments and policy. Now, in the Biden administration, we see them moving in this right direction by rhetorically affirming the importance of democracy and human rights. And with any luck, we'll see the White House underwrite these words with action to include, hopefully, a fulsome strategy for advancing democracy worldwide. My second policy-focused recommendation would be that the US further approach democracy building as a truly political endeavor and not as an exercise in technocratic state building. As all the experts in the panel know in the audience, corrupt politics fuel violence at the hands of a range of actors, from governments seeking to suppress dissent to armed non-state groups endeavoring to displace a ruling regime. Now, these and other aspects of a given conflict system are political, and they need political solutions as a result. In part, this entails being prepared to use significant carrots and sticks through diplomacy to constrain or change the behavior of elites who orchestrate violence. Elites at the top, the capital, as well as those at the subnational level. Absent those credible threats or incentives and change on the part of elites, foreign assistance projects and capacity building can only do so much. Using diplomacy in this way is something that PDAS Steinhelfer's bureau at the State Department has been leading on for many, many years. Shifting down to the second portion of my remarks in the operational aspect, the diplomacy is essential, but alone not sufficient for democracy building. At IRI, we recently concluded a year-long study that resulted in a field guide for implementing DRG programs in conflict-affected states. And there are two key takeaways, among others, related to the framing questions on best practices for today's session. The first pertained to gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI. We found that the most successful programs across the board carefully assessed spaces in which to engage in changing norms of inclusion. In some cases, these spaces were formal and in others informal. And for practices on GESI more broadly, we found that it absolutely needs to be mainstreamed across all programming sectors to ensure that interventions do not exacerbate divisions and solidify barriers. The second set of best practices, and this picks up on PDAS Steinhelfer's remarks on the importance of measurement, concerns determining if and how we have been successful in conflict environments. The overriding challenge of evaluations we found in such settings is the constraints on research. For instance, even the most seemingly benign questions can be perceived as invasive in fragile contexts. This often results in high levels of non-responses or evasive answers. To address this challenge, we've introduced a practice of list experiments and endorsement experiments and integrated them into our research instruments. We've also been able to improve our ability to integrate different streams of research to get a more holistic assessment of the context. To strengthen programming in these conflict settings, there's of course this pronounced need for better and more rigorous impact data. But there's also a need for more coherent narratives on the conflict itself. And this pertains to better understanding the problem to be able to devise the most effective strategy and solutions for it. In practice, this means consulting not only cutting-edge academic studies, but also novel accounts of the conflict narrated by, for example, just who are deeply embedded in the context, and also locals who are experiencing it. By combining hard data with stories and narratives, we can understand not only the major trends and the drivers of conflict, but also how individual narratives of the conflict confirm or contradict data in those large data sets. To close, I just want to reinforce the need to really actually integrate democracy into foreign policy decision-making rather than paying some lip service to it. To really see progress in the types of settings we're going to be talking about today, donors and host countries alike need to prioritize progress on democracy and rights. Thanks again to Gabrielle and team, and back to you, Ben.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. I think next up we have Vasu Mohan of IFES.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this great conversation. I really appreciate the comments of my previous two, my panelists. So I'm going to draw on my own experience and IFES's experience working in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades My first program that I worked in Afghanistan was funded by the Canadian government in partnership with Elections Canada. So this feels like a full circle and a lot of lessons learned. So the first point I want to make is that democracy is not something one group of people can simply bring to another. People have to be the initiators, implementers, and beneficiaries of their own democratic development. What we can do best as democracy assistance provider is to accompany them in that path, particularly with comparative examples of good practices from around the world. So democracy assistance, therefore, needs to center and be informed by deep expertise, primarily national, but also international experts with long history or knowledge and work in the specific country. And national experts should not only be brought in as advisors, but they should have real decision-making powers. The third point is that we need to adopt an honest, humble posture of learning and have an unwavering commitment to human rights. We need to be able to honestly say when we are not being successful. The points about being able to measure what we are doing and have our goals clear are extremely important. Equally important is the ability to be honest and the intention to clearly state where are we doing well, where are we not doing well, and how do we do mid-course corrections. Also, the commitment to human rights. Ends do not justify means. No matter how noble the end result sounds, if the path towards those goals do not embody the same principles we seek at the end, these efforts would be at best short-lived and in the worst case scenario, deeply damaging. For example, we cannot have a high tolerance for corruption in the name of efficacy if in the end we seek to establish or support a society and government that will function with integrity. We cannot create lasting peace by co-opting warlords or others who use violence as a means to achieve their political aims. Also, we cannot see sustainable gender equality or pluralism if in our design and implementation, we do not meaningfully include women, minorities, and people with disabilities as key decision makers. It was great to hear from my previous panelists on the importance of inclusion. Recently, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, brought out a fantastic lessons learned report on the entire 2 decades of US democracy assistance, US assistance in Afghanistan. And one of the important lessons that they talked about was really knowing the context. And this is where this deep knowledge and drawing on knowledge is extremely important. In the SIGAR report, it says the US government did not understand the Afghan context and therefore failed to tailor its efforts accordingly. So this is really, effective democracy assistance requires a detailed understanding of country's social, economic, and political dynamics. In Afghanistan's case, where we learned religion and tribal culture and ethnicity played a major role in society, especially in power dynamics and relationships. And democracy assistance programs sometimes cherry pick, sometimes co-opted convenient aspects of religion and social and culture, but did not necessarily tap into the deeply transformative potential of religion and culture. And whereas those trying to subvert democracy positioned themselves quite well as custodians of religion and tradition. So this was a really tough balance, and a lot of lessons, I hope, are being learned. And we are just in the beginning of learning these lessons. One other important point is sustainability. Also, just going back to that SIGAR report, which talks about the importance of sustainability and how U.S. reconstruction projects, even though they call for sustainability, often the Afghan counterparts did not have the capacity to take responsibility for those projects. In response, the US government tried to help Afghan institutions build their capacity, but those institutions could not keep up with the demands for fast progress. So in response to this, a lot of assistance was delivered outside of Afghan government channels. So while this was a convenient and expedient approach, but Afghan officials were then not getting the experience in managing and sustaining US reconstruction projects. As a result, even when programs were able to get short-term success, they often couldn't last because folks who would have to take responsibility for them were poorly equipped or are not trained as well. IFAS recently completed a study identifying successful democracy and governance approaches in post-conflict countries. So the purpose of this project is to look at a deep dive into 25 years of programming as part of the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, CEPS, with our partners NDI and IRI, and to reflect on how to make current and future interventions more effective. One of the key findings was that interventions that drew more praise from local partners and whose gains are still visible well after the projects ended had a few things in common. One was ownership was quickly and effectively transferred to national partners. Second, those were relatively easy or affordable to maintain by the national partners. And these interventions permanently change rules, practices, and perceptions. So these are lessons that we are learning that are sort of mirrored across different sectors and different institutions that have been engaging in democracy assistance. The last point that I want to make is democracy assistance also needs to consider regional geopolitics. The role of neighboring countries, in the case of Afghanistan, Pakistan to a large extent, and to a lesser extent, India and Iran, they were all key actors, and democracy assistance to Afghanistan, had to be located and understood in that context of regional, dynamics. And now China is going to play a significant role in Afghanistan's fragile trajectory. So these are some, lessons. And to close, just really wanted to say that being honest, being humble about what we are engaged in, and unwavering support and commitment to human rights were some really important lessons that I hope that we will